Tonight, we're going to a place that began not as a comfortable aristocratic retreat, nor as a triumph of considered urban planning. It began as an act of shivering, highly militarised paranoia on the edge of the North Sea. Bamburgh was constructed because a succession of early medieval warlords looked at a 90-foot slab of barren volcanic rock and realised it was the absolute most inconvenient place in northern England for their rivals to abruptly cancel their dynasty. It is a monument to the profound administrative benefits of terrible weather and a sheer vertical drop. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Before we concern ourselves with kings and crowns and the inevitable administrative failures of the Anglo-Saxons, we must first acknowledge the rock. Because at Bamburgh, the geology is not decorative, it is the entire point. Roughly 295 million years ago, the Earth produced a dolerite intrusion known as the Wind Sill. For those who prefer their geology without the jargon, this essentially means a massive slab of volcanic rock pushed its way to the surface and then stubbornly refused to erode. It sits on the edge of the North Sea with a certain kind of geological arrogance. The eastern face drops steeply toward the crashing water, rendering a naval assault not just impractical, but logistically embarrassing. The western approach is steep but accessible, which in medieval real estate is the equivalent of a front door that requires you to walk uphill while people throw heavy objects at you. Crucially, the plateau on top is vast. It is large enough, in fact, to hold an entire royal complex. This turns the rock into a lighthouse of power. You did not simply stumble upon Bamburgh. You saw it from miles away, and you understood immediately that whoever lived up there was heavily armed and entirely uninterested in your opinions. Long before the year 547, the local Britons had already noted the administrative convenience of this location. They called the stronghold Dinguari, the power centre of the Brittonic kingdom of Brynich. At this stage, the defences would have been constructed of timber and earth ramparts. Timber, as we have noted before, is an enthusiastic building material but ultimately a temporary one. The English, when they eventually arrived, did not discover this location, they simply inherited it, which is a polite way of saying they noticed someone else had done the hard work of finding a highly defensible cliff and decided they would like the lease. In the year 547, the post-Roman administrative vacuum of northern Britain was filled by a gentleman named Ida. Ida was an Anglo-Saxon warlord who, according to later chroniclers, was known as the Flame Bearer. This is generally not a nickname one acquires by being polite at dinner parties. Ida looked at the sheer 90-foot drop to the North Sea and decided this would be an excellent place to put a fence. He claimed the rock and the surrounding territory of Bernicia, which would eventually swell into the rather formidable and highly unstable kingdom of Northumbria. He constructed a timber palisade around the perimeter. We must pause to consider the sheer logistical misery of this task. Driving massive wooden posts into solid dolerite volcanic rock without modern steel or power tools is not architecture. It is a masterclass in blister-inducing futility. Furthermore, as we have noted before, timber is a building material favoured primarily by those who lack a healthy, long-term pessimism. Wood rots in the sea air. It requires constant, expensive maintenance. But for the moment it served its purpose. It kept the locals out, and it kept the arrows away from the king. Within a few generations, the fortress acquired a new name, Bebbanburg. The venerable bead tells us it was named after Queen Bebba, the wife of Ida's grandson, Athelfrith. Now, the early medieval period was not known for its progressive views on gender equality. It was a hyper-masculine era where political disputes were generally solved with an axe. So, for a fortress to be explicitly named after a queen is a fascinating administrative anomaly. It suggests that Athelfrith gifted the rock to his wife as a marital estate. One can only imagine the romance of receiving a heavily militarised windswept toll booth for an anniversary present. But the name stuck. It branded the rock not just as a military installation, but as a dynastic home. A place where a royal family could settle down, oversee the realm, and occasionally hurl boiling liquids at their neighbours. By the 7th century, Bamburgh was not just a fortress. It was a cathedral of political violence. This brings us to King Oswald. Oswald was a highly effective king who successfully united the warring halves of Northumbria. He was wealthy, powerful, and pious, right up until the moment he engaged in a minor zoning dispute with King Penda of Mercia in 642. Penda was a staunch pagan who had absolutely no respect for Christian administrative boundaries. He killed Oswald in battle. Oswald's right arm, which, according to legend, had been blessed by a bishop and remained miraculously uncorrupted, was rescued from the battlefield. It was brought back to Bamburgh, placed in a silver shrine, and venerated as a holy relic. This is what we might politely call relic politics. It is one thing to tell your subjects that you have the divine right to rule. It is quite another to keep your saintly uncle's indestructible limb on the mantelpiece to prove it. Early medieval kingship was a delicate fusion of sanctity and sovereignty. Possessing a major relic was the medieval equivalent of having a nuclear deterrent. It provided immense diplomatic leverage and a highly lucrative stream of pilgrim tourism. Bamburgh effectively became both a throne and a shrine. It was a highly efficient dual-purpose centre of government where you could pay your agricultural taxes and pray for your immortal soul in the exact same afternoon. This highly profitable arrangement worked reasonably well until the end of the 10th century. In 993, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, with a weary sense of inevitability, that the Vikings arrived. The Norsemen had a well-documented enthusiasm for portable wealth and a deep historical prejudice against wooden architecture. They did not care about saintly arms unless they were encased in easily meltable silver. They sacked the fortress. The timber structures inevitably caught fire. The inherent flaw of building a fortress on a massive coastal rock is that while it serves as a brilliant lighthouse of your own power, it also serves as a brilliant lighthouse for passing pirates. It was a severe administrative setback for the Northumbrians, but the rock, displaying its usual geologic indifference, remained exactly where it was. The buildings were reduced to ash. The locals were subjected to a vigorous demographic restructuring, but the strategic value of the cliff was completely untouched. The Vikings could burn the palisade, but they could not burn the dolerite. It is around this dark, imposing and repeatedly violent landscape that local folklore naturally gathered. The most famous is the legend of the Laidley Worm of Spindlestone Hough. It is a local myth involving a wicked stepmother, a princess cursed to live as a venomous dragon, and a prince who is forced to kiss the reptile to break the spell. We will classify this strictly as lore rather than historical fact, mostly because dragons are notoriously terrible at keeping written records. But one can see why the local peasantry invented stories about giant, wealth-hoarding reptiles living on the rock. When you spend your entire life watching heavily armed men sitting on a cliff, hoarding the local grain, and occasionally setting the neighbourhood on fire, referring to them as dragons, is really just a polite political allegory. Bamburgh, even when temporarily inconvenienced by angry Scandinavians, remained a place where magic, or at least highly aggressive regional taxation, was simply inevitable. By the dawn of the 11th century, the Rock of Bamburgh was effectively operating as the headquarters of a very stubborn, very heavily armed regional management firm, the House of Bamburgh. They were the ealdormen of Bernicia. They ruled the northern half of Northumbria, answering to the King of England in the south, but generally treating his commands as polite suggestions rather than binding legal documents. The distance from London to Bamburgh provided a highly convenient administrative buffer. At the turn of the century, the patriarch of this family was a man named Waltheof. By the year 1006, Waltheof had achieved something remarkable for a northern warlord. He had grown old. Unfortunately, aging in the 11th century was a profound strategic vulnerability. King Malcolm II of Scotland, observing that Waltheof was essentially confined to his wooden chair at Bamburgh, decided this was an excellent time for a hostile acquisition of Northumbrian territory. He marched his army south and besieged Durham. Waltheof, demonstrating the cautious wisdom of a man who prefers his limbs attached, chose to remain behind the timber walls of Bamburgh and effectively ignore the problem. This left a rather severe human resources crisis. Fortunately for the English, Wulftheoff's son, Uhtred, was available. Uhtred was young, ambitious, and possessed a level of kinetic aggression that the era highly valued. Uhtred raised an army from the surrounding shires, marched on Durham, and inflicted a catastrophic defeat upon the Scots. It was a decisive victory. But what followed the battle tells us everything we need to know about the political ecosystem of early medieval Bamburgh. Uhtred did not simply accept a surrender. He gathered the heads of the most prominent Scottish warriors, brought them back to Bamburgh, and placed them on spikes along the timber palisade. It is easy to dismiss this as mere barbarism, but we must view it through the lens of 11th century public relations. In Northumbria, power required visible, undeniable brutality. Placing heads on the walls was not an act of random cruelty, it was civic communication. It was a heavily localised billboard informing anyone travelling the coastal road that the new management was highly proactive. The historical chronicles provide us with an intensely bureaucratic detail about this event. Uhtred hired local women to wash the heads and comb their hair before they were displayed, paying them each a piece of silver for their trouble. News of Uhtred's extreme competence reached the south. It eventually reached the desk of King Ethelred. Ethelred is famously known to history as the Unready, a translation of the Old English unread, which actually means badly advised. Though looking at his reign, chronically incompetent would also have been a fair assessment. Ethelred was constantly being bullied by Danish Vikings and desperately needed competent regional managers. Recognising that Uhtred had essentially solved the Scottish problem on his lunch break, the king promoted him. He made Uhtred the ealdorman of York as well as Bernicia. For a brief shining moment, the entire north of England was united under the House of Bamburgh. This was the absolute political zenith of the Anglo-Saxon stronghold. From a wooden box on a rock, Uhtred commanded the most dangerous half of the country. He solidified this power not just with the sword, but with highly aggressive marital logistics. Uhtred was a man who understood that a well-placed wedding was significantly cheaper than a siege. His first marriage was to Ecgfrida, the daughter of the Bishop of Durham. This was a strategic merger that granted him control of vast, lucrative church estates. However, once he acquired York, a city heavily populated by wealthy, powerful Danes, Uhtred realised his portfolio needed diversifying, so he simply sent Ecgfrida back to her father. Divorce in the early medieval period was surprisingly straightforward when one party had a private army. He then married Sige, the daughter of a prominent Danish nobleman, effectively securing his market share in Yorkshire. Finally, his rising status allowed for the ultimate promotion. He discarded the Danish wife and married Elfgifu, the daughter of King Ethelred himself. He had successfully networked his way from a regional border guard to the king's son-in-law. This was, of course, entirely too successful, and in history, being too successful usually results in a fatal scheduling error. In 1016, the political landscape collapsed. The Danes, led by Cnut the Great, invaded England in force. King Ethelred died, and Uhtred found himself having backed the wrong and now deceased horse. The new Danish king was a pragmatist. He summoned Uhtred to a diplomatic meeting at Wiggle to negotiate terms of peace. When Uhtred arrived at the hall, the meeting did not take place. Instead, a man named Thurbrand the Hold, a rival northern nobleman acting on Cnut's behalf, stepped out from behind a curtain with 40 armed men and murdered Uhtred. It was a political execution meticulously disguised as a calendar invite. Uhtred's death shattered the House of Bamburgh. The north fractured once again, but more importantly, the assassination sparked a blood feud. For the next several generations, the House of Bamburgh and the family of Thurbrand the Hold engaged in a tedious reciprocal exchange of homicides. It was a multi-generational administrative nightmare, essentially passing down murder as a family heirloom. This internal cyclical violence drained the House of Bamburgh of its focus and its resources. Their autonomy weakened. The north would never be this independent again, and through it all Bamburgh was still made of timber. It was still wood atop dolerite. Politically, the House of Bamburgh had reached its maximum possible altitude, but structurally they were still sitting in a highly flammable box, waiting for the wind to change. Following the Norman conquest of 1066, the north of England treated instructions from London with a mixture of mild amusement and violent hostility. The Norman kings quickly discovered that Northumbria was not so much a region, as it was an administrative black hole. It had endured Scandinavian entanglements, the rule of semi-autonomous, highly aggressive earls, and the conqueror's own harrying of the north, a pacification strategy so thorough and brutal that it effectively temporarily deleted Yorkshire from the economic record. Through all of this, Bamburgh remained a stubborn symbol of northern identity. It was the physical embodiment of the North's refusal to be properly managed. This tension inevitably resulted in a severe breach of protocol in 1095. Robert de Mowbray, the Earl of Northumbria, decided to engage in a minor act of treason against King William II. When summoned to the royal court to explain himself, Mowbray made the bold strategic choice to simply not attend. Instead, he withdrew behind the timber walls of Bamburgh. He did not intend to fight a glorious final stand. He intended to sit. Mowbray understood that Bamburgh's greatest defensive asset was not the height of the rock, nor the sharpness of the spears. It was time. He calculated that the king's army would eventually get bored, run out of food, or catch a seasonal illness, and simply go home. King William II, however, was a man of immense petty vindictiveness, backed by the treasury of England. When the king arrived at the windsill, he looked at the sheer 90-foot drop, and correctly concluded that attempting to storm the cliff would be a magnificent waste of perfectly good soldiers. So, he built his own castle next door. Just outside the gates of Bamburgh, William constructed a temporary siege fortress. With a distinct lack of subtlety, he named it Malvoisin, which translates from the Old French as bad neighbour. This is the medieval military equivalent of a passive-aggressive post-it note, translated into timber and earthworks. Malvoisin stood within clear sight of Bamburgh's walls. It was close enough to watch, close enough to block any incoming grain carts, and close enough to be profoundly irritating. Medieval warfare was rarely about glorious cavalry charges. It was overwhelmingly economic. Food mattered significantly more than fury. By building Malvoisin, King William essentially turned Bamburgh from a fortress into a highly secure, slowly depleting pantry. This was not a siege of assault. It was a siege of humiliation. Eventually, Mowbray made the poor logistical decision to sneak out of Bamburgh to gather supplies, at which point he was promptly captured. The Crown took direct control of the rock. This moment, while perhaps lacking the cinematic flair of a bloody battle, is the most important administrative pivot in the castle's history. It marks the absolute end of northern regional autonomy. Bamburgh was no longer the seat of a proud, independent northern lord. It was a royal outpost, and for a royal outpost timber would no longer do. By the later 12th century, under the reign of King Henry II, the Crown decided that the northern border required a permanent, heavy and undeniable statement of authority. The wooden palisades that had burned and been rebuilt for 600 years were cleared away. They began the construction of the Great Square Keep. This was not a repair. It was a replacement of the entire philosophy of the site. Building a massive stone keep on top of the windsill presented immediate agonising engineering problems. The dolerite rock is an igneous intrusion. It is incredibly hard, remarkably unyielding, and entirely rejects the concept of a shovel. Because cutting deep foundations was practically impossible, the royal masons had to improvise. They levelled the plateau as best they could. Rather than sinking the building into the ground, they anchored the walls directly onto the bedrock, reinforcing the masonry with iron cramps. To compensate for the lack of a deep foundation, they built the walls to a frankly paranoid thickness of up to 3.5 metres. The keep does not sit in the rock, it clamps onto it. It grips the cliff like a limestone barnacle. Where the early Anglo-Saxon kings had used the rock as a stage to elevate their wooden halls, the Normans used the rock as a foundation to anchor a machine of state. This fundamentally changed the shape of authority at Bamburgh. For half a millennium, the Anglo-Saxon Great Hall had been horizontal. It was a wide, timbered communal space, where the king and his warriors drank, boasted and slept in the same smoky room. The Norman keep, by contrast, was entirely vertical. It was layered. It was controlled. At the bottom level was storage, a quiet, dark accumulation of taxes and grain. Above that was the hall, for official business. Above that, the private chambers of the commander, and at the very top, the parapets for the guards. Access was physically restricted by narrow winding staircases. Movement was strictly regulated. Power was carefully compartmentalised. The architecture itself became a corporate hierarchy. The higher you were allowed to walk, the more important you were. The communal drinking hall was gone, replaced by the medieval equivalent of middle management. This social shift was profound. Under Norman control, the castle was governed by a constable, a man who ruled not by his own bloodline, but in the king's name. The romance of the heroic warlord was replaced by the terrifying efficiency of the inventory clerk. Supplies were counted. The military presence became permanent and professionalised. Through the 12th and 13th centuries, this massive stone keep served as the anchor for a growing complex. The plateau expanded into multiple wards. Stone walls traced the jagged edge of the windsill, finally wrapping the entire rock in masonry. Bamburgh was no longer an isolated stronghold. It became part of a franchise, a highly militarised network of royal castles, Alnwick, Newcastle, Warkworth, working together to form the immovable spine of English northern defence. This era of the castle's history is notably quiet, but it is a heavy, crushing sort of quiet. Uhtred had died by assassination. The timber halls of the old kings had burned to ash. Now the rock belonged to a distant king who spoke French and lived hundreds of miles to the south. The great keep stood heavy, cold, and entirely unapologetic. Where once the miraculous, uncorrupted arms of saints were venerated, now tax records were kept. Where once men ruled by the sheer force of their lineage and the sharpness of their axes, now authority descended by royal decree and written charter. The transformation of Bamburgh was complete. It was an architectural shift, yes, but more importantly, it was a cultural one. The era of the sword had quietly surrendered to the era of the ledger. By the 13th century, the Norman keep was no longer sitting alone on the rock. It had acquired company. The crown had realised that a single massive tower, while excellent for keeping the constable alive during a siege, was somewhat impractical for housing the sheer volume of men and material required to govern the north of England. And so, the entire plateau of the windsill was gradually enclosed in stone. The fortress expanded into 3 distinct areas, or wards. There was the inner ward, containing the great keep and the principal buildings of state. Below that, the middle ward, which housed the vital service buildings, the wells, and the kitchens. And finally, stretching out toward the vulnerable western approach, the outer ward, a sprawling complex of stables, workshops, and barracks. When you look at the footprint of Bamburgh from above, you notice immediately that the walls do not impose any sort of rigid, satisfying geometry upon the landscape. The medieval masons did not attempt to build a perfect square or a mathematically precise star. They simply followed the cliff. Unlike the planned Norman castles of the south, which were often built on flat ground where engineers could indulge in symmetrical fantasies, Bamburgh was dictated by the dolerite. The walls traced the jagged, uneven rim of the rock. The cliff was not treated as an obstacle to be overcome. It was treated as a curtain wall thoughtfully provided by geology. The castle does not sit on the landscape. It becomes the landscape. This vast enclosure was strictly necessary, because Bamburgh was no longer just a defensive structure. It had become a machine of logistics. This brings us to the kitchens, which is where the true scale of medieval royal administration becomes apparent. When King Edward I, or later Edward III, decided to visit Bamburgh, they did not arrive quietly. A medieval royal progress was not a vacation. It was the relocation of a small, highly demanding city. The king travelled with hundreds of retainers, knights, clerks, pages, and servants. He travelled with hounds, hawks, and an alarming number of horses, and all of them required feeding. The kitchens in the middle ward had to scale their operations to a terrifying degree. The bread ovens were essentially small caverns, designed for the bulk production of coarse loaves. Brewing capacity had to be vast, primarily because drinking standing water in a crowded medieval military encampment was a highly efficient method of contracting dysentery. Ale was the baseline hydration for everyone from the king to the lower stable boy. Then there was the meat. There were no supply chains capable of delivering fresh beef to a besieged cliff, so the castle relied on vast storehouses of salted pork and beef, heavily preserved and requiring significant soaking just to render it chewable. Given their location above the North Sea, fish was abundant, though the historical records suggest a relentless, deeply monotonous diet of salted herring. During these royal visits, Bamburgh ceased to be a fortress and became essentially a highly fortified catering operation. From the late 13th century onward, the Anglo-Scottish border never truly slept. It was a region of chronic low-level friction, punctuated by episodes of intense violence. During the long, exhausting wars of Scottish independence, Bamburgh's primary function was not enduring constant siege. Its function was readiness, and readiness is incredibly expensive. It served as a staging ground for English armies marching north, providing a safe harbour where troops could assemble before crossing the border. Conversely, it functioned as a fallback refuge if Scottish forces moved south with enthusiastic speed. It housed high-value prisoners of war. Most importantly, it was a warehouse. The armories were constantly stocked. Inventories from the period list tens of thousands of arrows, hundreds of bows, and tightly wound bundles of crossbow bolts. Later, as the centuries dragged on, the records begin to mention the careful, nervous storage of early gunpowder. By the 1300s, noble residence was a secondary concern. Bamburgh was about maintaining a steady, reliable pipeline of violence. Which brings us to the men who actually ran the castle. We tend to focus on the kings and the knights, but the true power of a late medieval fortress resided in the administrative layer. Bamburgh was governed by a constable, but it was operated by clerks. Power here was bureaucratic. The surviving account books and wage rolls paint a picture of relentless paperwork. Men had to be paid their daily pence. Rations of grain and salted fish had to be meticulously logged. Every repair to a slate roof, every replacement of an iron hinge, and every purchase of a replacement horse was itemised. The rock had been tamed by paperwork. When the English kings did visit, it was rarely for their own comfort. Bamburgh is cold, damp, and exposed to the brutal winds of the North Sea. The king's presence was entirely theatrical. The English crown needed to occasionally project a visible, overwhelming authority in the north. The arrival of the royal standard reassured the loyal border lords that London had not forgotten them, while simultaneously intimidating any local barons who might be harbouring independent thoughts. It reinforced the military chain of command. Bamburgh was the heavy, unsmiling northern face of the English monarchy, and this provided a profound psychological edge. For Scottish raiders moving south to burn the Northumbrian harvest, Bamburgh was visible from miles away, a massive black crown of stone looming above the sea. It was not attacked very often, and the reason for this is quite simple. It was rarely attacked because it was exceedingly difficult to breach, but more importantly, it was rarely attacked because it simply wasn't worth the cost. To lay siege to Bamburgh required months of supplies, a vast army, and a tolerance for terrible weather. Most sensible raiders looked at the sheer walls, calculated the effort required, and politely walked past to pillage softer targets inland. The castle defended the region simply by existing. However, if we look closely at the late 14th and early 15th centuries, we can begin to see the earliest quiet signs of obsolescence. A shift was occurring in European warfare. For centuries, the entire defensive philosophy of Bamburgh relied on the sheer thickness of its walls and the height of its rock. It was designed to withstand the impact of rocks thrown by trebuchets and to make men on ladders very tired. But across the channel, artillery was beginning to emerge. Cannons were evolving from terrifying novelties into reliable siege engines. The age of dropping heavy things from a height was slowly giving way to the age of propelling heavy things at great speed. You did not need to be a visionary to look at a 3-metre thick stone wall and realise that, eventually, someone was going to build a cannon large enough to break it. The thick walls that had protected the kings of England were slowly, inevitably becoming liabilities. By the year 1464, the Wars of the Roses, a prolonged, heavily armed disagreement over royal property rights, had largely been decided in the mud of various English fields. The Yorkist faction, operating under King Edward IV, had successfully secured the crown. However, in the extreme north, a certain administrative stubbornness lingered. Bamburgh Castle was one of the final significant strongholds still holding out for the exiled and chronically ineffective Lancastrian King Henry VI. At this point, Bamburgh's value was no longer strictly military. It had acquired a heavy, inconvenient symbolic weight. A fortress that had once crowned the Anglo-Saxon kings and secured the northern border for the Normans was now sheltering the remnants of a collapsing dynasty. Its continued endurance was not a strategic threat so much as it was an ideological embarrassment. You cannot convincingly claim to rule a country if a massive, heavily fortified cliff in your northern territory flatly refuses to acknowledge your paperwork. The Yorkists could not leave such a banner standing. It had to be audited, and if necessary, it had to be removed. The task of reducing Bamburgh was handed to Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick, a man generally known to history as the Kingmaker. When Warwick marched north, he did not merely arrive with troops, ladders, and an optimistic attitude. He arrived with the Royal Artillery train. This distinction is profoundly important. For hundreds of years, Bamburgh had comfortably withstood escalade ladders, siege towers, and the heavy wooden mathematics of the trebuchet. The castle's entire defensive philosophy was based on the fact that its sheer height, combined with its massive stone blocks, could absorb or deflect any traditional impact. But artillery altered the fundamental conversation between the attacker and the wall. Warwick's siege of 1464 is generally recognised as one of the earliest significant examples in England of gunpowder artillery successfully reducing a major primary fortress. The cannons deployed by the Yorkists were large bombards, massive tubular machines forged of iron and brass. They were not elegant weapons. They were incredibly slow to load, profoundly unreliable, and occasionally just as dangerous to the men operating them as they were to the target. Moving them through the medieval English countryside required dozens of oxen, hundreds of men, and a truly impressive vocabulary of profanity. But when they were positioned, loaded, and fired successfully, they delivered something medieval walls had never experienced: concentrated, forward-moving, concussive energy. This is the crucial shift in the physics of siege warfare. A trebuchet operates on gravity. It throws a heavy stone in a high arc, hoping it lands on a roof or strikes a glancing blow against a parapet. A bombard simply hammers directly forward. Medieval curtain walls were engineered to carry their own immense vertical weight and to deflect things falling from above. They were not designed to absorb repeated high-velocity internal shock waves. Under sustained bombardment, the thick walls of Bamburgh began to experience a structural crisis. It was not a sudden, cinematic explosion. It was a methodical degradation. Stone blocks split along their natural faults. Deep mortar joints, which had held for centuries, began to vibrate, turn to dust and loosen. For 500 years, elevation had equal control. Standing on a high rock meant you were safe. But in 1464, the artillery train proved that elevation simply meant you were a highly visible, entirely stationary target. The height of the windsill had become an exposure. It is important to remain measured about the outcome. Bamburgh was damaged, but it was not annihilated. The Yorkist bombardment breached specific portions of the defensive works, rendering them structurally unsound. The keep did not dissolve into the North Sea, and the walls did not entirely collapse. What failed that day was not the dolerite rock. What failed was the assumption of impregnability. The Lancastrian garrison yielded. They surrendered not because the cliffs had somehow become lower, or because they lacked courage, but because they were professional soldiers who could do the math. Sustained artillery fire made prolonged resistance mathematically untenable. The psychological contract between the stone and the men hiding behind it had been permanently broken. The architectural consequence of this brief noisy siege was total. After 1464, military engineers across England and Scotland were forced to confront a highly uncomfortable new reality. The era of the tall, proud castle was over. Thickness alone was no longer sufficient. Height alone was no longer decisive. If a wall stood up straight, a cannon could knock it down. Over the coming centuries, fortress design would dramatically change. Walls would become lower, thicker, and sharply angled to deflect cannonballs. Deep earthworks would replace sheer stone drops. The medieval fortress did not disappear overnight, but its supremacy had effectively ended. Bamburgh had stood for centuries as an untouchable acropolis, a monument to the permanence of geology and the authority of kings. Now it stood as a building that could be reasoned with by black powder. For half a millennium, Bamburgh's authority had derived from the earth. The wind sill provided elevation. The stone walls provided mass. The layered wards provided depth. But the events of 1464 demonstrated that a few iron tubes and a chemical mixture could quietly negate all three. Following the artillery breach of 1464, Bamburgh Castle found itself in a rather awkward historical position. The walls were eventually patched, the debris was cleared away, and the gates were rehung. But the enthusiasm of the English crown had permanently departed. The late medieval government was increasingly occupied with other more pressing matters. They were focused on the heavily fortified border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, on the construction of dedicated coastal artillery platforms in the south, and on the chronic, exhausting political instability of their own noblemen. Bamburgh remained an incredibly impressive structure to look at, but it was no longer strictly indispensable. It had been quietly shifted from a frontline military asset to a regional backup. This is the reality of obsolescence. Castles rarely collapse immediately after a military defeat. More often, they are simply downgraded in importance by distant clerks. The funding slows. The orders for structural repairs are politely postponed. The garrison numbers are allowed to shrink through natural attrition. The vast stone structure remains, but the urgency that built it does not. Then, in 1603, an event occurred that altered Bamburgh's identity more profoundly than Warwick's cannons ever could. Queen Elizabeth I died without an heir, and King James VI of Scotland travelled south to become King James I of England. With a single carriage ride, the crowns were united. For hundreds of years, the entire justification for Bamburgh's massive scale, its armouries, and its vast kitchens was the hostile Scottish border. Suddenly, that border softened. It was no longer a heavily militarised fracture between two warring nations. It was merely an internal administrative boundary, separating two groups of taxpayers who reported to the exact same monarch. Bamburgh had been engineered as a machine for managing hostility. Now the hostility had evaporated. The castle's original violent purpose simply thinned into irrelevance. For a time, the Crown retained ownership, but their approach to maintenance became fiercely pragmatic. Roof timbers were replaced only when their collapse was completely imminent. Sections of the curtain wall were stabilised rather than entirely rebuilt. The remaining garrison and administrators consolidated themselves into smaller, more easily heated clusters of rooms. Large areas of the complex simply closed. The three great wards, which had once supported mobile armies and royal entourages, now felt absurdly oversized. Eventually the Crown recognised that maintaining a redundant cliff-top fortress was a poor use of treasury funds. The estate passed to the Forster family. The Forsters were local gentry. They were wealthy, but they were wealthy by the standards of rural landowners, not by the standards of medieval monarchs. And yet they were now tasked with maintaining a structure vastly larger than their income could ever justify. The shift here is fundamental. Bamburgh was no longer a royal instrument, it was a private expense. When the Forsters took the keys, they inherited the surrounding agricultural lands and the regional rental income. But they also inherited a colossal stone liability, permanently exposed to the brutal winds of the North Sea. Merely heating a fraction of the keep during a Northumbrian winter would have required a small forest. Keeping a slate roof on such a sprawling complex required constant, exhausting capital. The revenue generated by sheep and barley rarely matched the scale of the walls. The castle had become financially disproportionate to its utility. This economic strain was eventually compounded by a spectacularly poor political miscalculation. During the Jacobite Rising of 1715, Thomas Forster decided to re-enter national politics. He declared his support for the exiled Stuart dynasty against the Hanoverian king George I. He was appointed a general of the rebel forces, a position for which he possessed absolutely no military qualifications. The rebellion predictably failed. Thomas Forster was captured at Preston. Although he eventually managed a rather dramatic escape to France, his family was ruined. Their estates were forfeited, and their debts deepened to an unmanageable degree. Bamburgh once again found itself attached to a losing side, though this time it was not as a proud fortress of armed resistance, but simply as the collateral damage of a failed allegiance. It was confiscated by the Crown, a bankrupt estate waiting to be liquidated. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the primary enemy of Bamburgh Castle was no longer military or political. It was environmental. The North Sea wind is relentless, and it drives salt directly into the mortar joints. Without constant, proactive maintenance, the roofs began to weaken under the exposure. The upper floors of the keep deteriorated. The windows, long since stripped of their expensive glass, stood open to the gales. Entire sections of the complex became entirely uninhabitable. The outer wards, once loud with the noise of blacksmiths, horses, and nervous soldiers, grew completely quiet. Grass crept steadily across the cobblestone courtyards. Maintenance was no longer a matter of improvement. It was a desperate, reactive attempt to slow the decay. The fortress did not fall. It simply hollowed out. The castle that had once housed kings, saints, and heavy artillery now stood as a diminished landmark. It was still imposing from a distance. It was still visible for miles along the coast, but internally it had been exhausted by underinvestment. Its political role had ended in 1603. Its economic viability had been strained to the breaking point by the Forsters. Its architecture, built entirely to command armies, was now standing empty, waiting for a purpose. For 5 centuries, Bamburgh had justified its immense scale through absolute necessity. It was required for border wars, for projecting royal authority, and for staging invasions. But by the 1700s, that necessity had vanished. The castle had not been conquered. It had simply been outgrown. The dolerite rock remained monumental, but the institution built upon it had become a heavy, crumbling burden, entirely disproportionate to the era in which it now found itself. Following the spectacular financial collapse of the Forster family, Bamburgh Castle found itself in the rather undignified position of a bankrupt estate awaiting liquidation. It was acquired in the early 18th century under the will of Nathaniel Crewe, the Bishop of Durham. Crewe, being a man of the church and possessing a functional understanding of winter weather on the Northumbrian coast, had absolutely no intention of living in a draughty, crumbling medieval fortress. Instead, he converted the estate into a charitable endowment. This marks a profound structural pivot in the history of the rock. For 6 centuries, Bamburgh had been owned by bloodline, by the crown, or by outright conquest. Now it was administered by a board of trustees. It ceased to be a hereditary stronghold and became an institutional asset. The authority of the castle no longer derived from the sharpness of a sword or the lineage of a king. It derived from a legal charter and committee oversight. It was the ultimate administrative triumph over feudalism. The true transformation, however, arrived in the mid-18th century with Dr. John Sharp. Sharp was an Anglican cleric deeply shaped by Enlightenment ideals. When he assumed administration of the estate, he looked at the sprawling, decaying ruins of Bamburgh and did not see a romantic monument to a lost age. He saw a massive, highly durable structure that was currently wasting space. Sharp did not attempt to restore the castle to its medieval grandeur. He had no interest in rebuilding a military machine. He simply stabilised what was usable. His repairs were aggressively pragmatic. Roofs were secured only where human habitation required it. Rotted floors were reinforced with sensible timber. Windows that had been open to the gales for decades were finally reglazed. Large, echoing medieval halls were subdivided into smaller, easily heated rooms. Under Sharp's direction, the castle was not romanticised. It was rationalised. The stone was entirely stripped of its military ego and forced into utility. One of his most significant interventions was the creation of a free medical dispensary within the walls of the keep. This was not a symbolic gesture of aristocratic pity. It was a fully operational clinic. Local residents, who previously had very few options regarding their health, could come to the castle for basic medical treatment. Later in the century, the dispensary even began administering early smallpox vaccinations. There is a deep, quiet irony here. The massive stone keep that had once stored tens of thousands of armour-piercing arrows was now actively storing remedies. The 3.5-metre-thick walls that had been engineered to protect violent men from artillery were now being used to insulate the sick. Sharp also established a school within the castle to provide education for local children. The curriculum was strictly functional: reading, basic arithmetic, and religious catechism. The objective was not to produce aristocratic scholars, but to instill practical literacy in the rural poor. The rock that had once projected military control over the landscape was now projecting civic competence. Perhaps the most strategically brilliant feature of Sharp's Enlightenment reforms, however, was his use of the castle as a regional granary. In the 18th century, rural famine was still a very real, very terrifying mathematical possibility following a poor harvest. Sharp utilised the immense storage capacity of the medieval vaults to engage in what we might now call aggressive price stabilisation. The trust would purchase grain in bulk during years of abundance, store it securely behind the Norman masonry, and then sell it back to the local population at an affordable, fixed price during years of scarcity. This was not charity in the sentimental weeping sense. It was a calculated economic buffer against starvation. Where the castle had once stockpiled salted meat to outlast a siege, it now stockpiled grain to outlast the weather. And the weather, it must be noted, remained terrible. Bamburgh's geography had not changed. The North Sea, maintaining its long historical tradition of unprovoked hostility, continued to smash merchant vessels against the coast. Just offshore lay the Farne Islands, a jagged archipelago that essentially functioned as a geological trap for shipping. Under the Crew Trust, parts of the castle were specifically designated to house and treat shipwreck survivors. Furthermore, Sharp instituted a policy regarding the coastal fog. When visibility dropped, the castle garrison was instructed to fire a cannon at regular intervals. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was a complete functional inversion of the castle's original purpose. They were firing heavy artillery into the mist, not to repel an invading fleet, but to guide passing vessels safely away from the rocks. Gunpowder, a tool invented entirely for destruction, had been reassigned as an instrument of warning. Sharp's work over the decades did not erase the medieval fortress, it simply repurposed it. The cold stone barracks became dormitories. The damp storage vaults became heavily inventoried supply rooms. The defensive chambers were transformed into heated classrooms and clinic waiting areas. The three great wards remained structurally intact, tracing the same jagged edge of the dolerite cliff they always had. But their meaning had shifted. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the castle was no longer justified by the threat of war. It was justified by the delivery of service. By the end of the 19th century, the Crew Trust had done admirable, highly practical work. But maintaining a sprawling medieval fortress on an exposed coastal cliff requires a level of capital that even a well-managed grain reserve struggles to produce. In 1894, the rock was purchased by a man named William Armstrong. Armstrong was not an antiquarian romantic, and he did not possess a grand feudal bloodline. He was a hydraulic engineer, an inventor, and a highly successful manufacturer of heavy artillery. He was the absolute embodiment of high Victorian industrial capitalism. His personal fortune was not derived from ancient land rents or royal favour, but from steel, steam machinery, and lucrative government weapons contracts. The rock, displaying its usual total indifference to the resume of its landlord, passed from the hands of clerical administrators into the hands of heavy industry. To understand this purchase, we must understand the national mood of the late 19th century. Britain, sitting at the rather exhausting height of a global empire, had developed a deeply cultivated, slightly theatrical interest in its own past. Gothic revival architecture was fashionable. Chivalric imagery was entirely the rage. Bamburgh, windswept, massive and partially decayed, represented something the Victorians desperately wanted to acquire: continuity. Armstrong did not buy a functioning fortress. The military value of the windsill had expired centuries ago. What he purchased for a considerable sum was a silhouette. Being a practical engineer, Armstrong's approach to the castle was fiercely methodical. The work undertaken was extensive, expensive, and structurally profound. Collapsing sections of the curtain wall were not merely patched, they were aggressively rebuilt. Internal structures that had rotted beyond salvation were entirely replaced. The engineering behind this restoration was entirely modern. Heavy timber roofs were reconstructed using massive quantities of imported teak, a wood chosen for its immense durability and its complete refusal to bow to the North Sea damp. Behind the ancient stone, Armstrong installed modern heating systems. Later, plumbing and electrical infrastructure were carefully woven through the medieval masonry. But the exterior profile, the jagged, intimidating skyline of the keep and walls against the grey sea, was meticulously preserved. The medieval outline remained entirely intact. The internal systems, however, were brought firmly into the industrial age. Inside the walls, the castle was completely reimagined. This was not archaeological conservation in the strict, cautious modern sense. It was a selective, highly curated restoration. The great halls, which had once hosted freezing, heavily armed Anglo-Saxon warlords, were restored to host polite Victorian receptions. Staterooms were furnished with an eye toward historical atmosphere rather than strict chronological accuracy. Bamburgh became a hybrid. It was part authentic medieval structure, part comfortable Victorian residence, and part national stage set. The authentic stone merely provided the envelope for a carefully curated atmosphere of heritage. Under Armstrong, the economic model of the rock changed yet again. It was no longer a royal border machine, and it was no longer a charitable welfare centre dispensing smallpox vaccines. It became a private estate, maintained not by taxation or agricultural surplus, but by the overwhelming capital of the Industrial Revolution. There is a structural irony here. In 1464, the illusion of Bamburgh's invincibility had been permanently shattered by the arrival of the Royal Artillery train. 430 years later, the castle was saved from total ruin by the immense personal fortune of a man whose primary industry was the advancement of artillery. Gunpowder had broken the medieval fortress. Industrial engineering rebuilt its image. But the point of Bamburgh is not irony. It is continuity. The rock endured. The system sitting on top of it simply evolved to match the century. Today, Bamburgh exists in a rather complicated dual condition. It remains in the private stewardship of the Armstrong family, yet it is open to the public. It functions as a cultural landmark, a heavily utilised cinematic backdrop, and a deeply layered historical artefact. The silhouette that once projected the violent authority of the border now projects a managed, profitable heritage. Modern Bamburgh is not an untouched medieval fortress. It is not a pure Victorian reconstruction. It is an accumulation. Anglo-Saxon timber once stood here. Norman stone replaced it. 15th century artillery fractured it. 18th century trustees rationalised it. And 19th century industrial wealth stabilised it. There is a specific quiet comfort to be found in the obsolescence of Bamburgh Castle. For most of its history, this rock was a place of high anxiety, harsh weather, monotonous diets, and the constant possibility of steel. It was an engine built for crisis. but history has a way of exhausting its emergencies. Today, the castle's only demand is that you pay a modest admission fee to witness over 1,400 years of endurance. It is a useful reminder that even the most heavily fortified, seemingly insurmountable problems eventually run out of momentum and fade into the landscape. The archers have long since gone home, the bombards are silent. What once felt urgent now rests under careful preservation. All that remains is the stone and the quiet,